Most abandoned buildings just sit there, quietly falling apart. These are different. Behind the crumbling walls and rusted bars of America's abandoned prisons are riots, executions, medical experiments, and enough asbestos and structural collapse to keep even the most confident urban explorer out for good. So here are 13 abandoned prisons in America, too dangerous to enter. Number 13. Yuma Territorial Prison, Arizona. Yuma Territorial Prison opened its gates in July 1876 at the edge of the Colorado River in the Arizona desert, and over the next 33 years, it processed more than 3,000 inmates, including train robbers, murderers, and a notorious gunfighter named Buckskin Frank Leslie, who had once worked alongside Wyatt Earp in Tombstone. Despite its brutal reputation, local residents at the time nicknamed it the Country Club on the Colorado, since inmates got access to a library with 2,000 books, 2 bathtubs, 3 showers, and one of the first electric generators anywhere in the territory. The prison closed in 1909 after overcrowding forced the state to transfer everyone to a new facility in Florence, Arizona, but Yuma wasn't done with its former prison quite yet. When Yuma High School burned down in 1910, the school district simply moved classes directly into the empty cell blocks for the next 4 years, holding assemblies in the old prison hospital. During that unusual stretch, the school's football team beat a rival squad from Phoenix so soundly that the losing fans mockingly called them the Criminals, a nickname the school adopted with pride and still uses to this day. Much of the original prison was later demolished to make way for a railroad, and what remains today sits inside a state historic park, with a handful of original cell blocks still standing, but structurally too fragile for anyone to wander through unsupervised. It remains the only high school in the country whose football stadium is quite literally built partly from prison walls. One of the site's more infamous features was the dark cell, a solitary confinement chamber carved directly into a hillside and used sparingly to punish the most unruly inmates, since a stint inside it in total blackness was considered one of the harshest available punishments in the territory. Notable prisoners over the years included Barney K. Riggs, who helped stop a prison riot and saved a superintendent's life, earning himself an early pardon before eventually dying in a gunfight in Texas. Between the crumbling cell blocks, the eroded guard tower, and decades of exposure to the desert heat along the Colorado River, park officials keep several of the remaining structures roped off, considering them too weathered and unstable for anyone to enter without supervision. Number 12. Old Idaho Penitentiary, Boise, Idaho. The Old Idaho Penitentiary opened in 1872, built largely by the labor of its own inmates using sandstone quarried from a nearby ridge, and it went on to house more than 13,000 prisoners over the next century, including Harry Orchard, the man who assassinated Idaho's governor in 1905. Over its lifetime, the prison recorded more than 500 escape attempts, with roughly 90 of them actually succeeding, a statistic that says a great deal about the quality of its walls. By the early 1970s, conditions inside had become genuinely dangerous, sparking serious riots in 1971 and again in 1973, both of which included inmates setting fire to entire buildings. The 1973 riot alone destroyed the dining hall and several cell houses, and combined with outdated plumbing, no real heating system, and a prison population that kept outgrowing the space, state officials finally gave up entirely, transferring the last 416 inmates to a new facility and closing the old Idaho Penitentiary for good on December 3, 1973. Today, the Idaho State Historical Society runs the site as a museum, but several of the fire-damaged buildings remain too structurally unstable for general access, roped off behind glass and warning signs rather than open for exploration. It's one of only 4 surviving territorial prisons in the entire country still standing in any recognizable form. The prison's rose garden, oddly enough, sits directly on top of what used to be its gallows, since 6 of the site's 10 total executions took place on that exact patch of ground before it was repurposed into a memorial garden decades later. Notable inmates over the prison's century of operation included Lyda Southard, nicknamed Idaho's Lady Bluebeard, after being convicted of killing several husbands for their life insurance payouts. With over 13,000 inmates passing through the sandstone walls across 101 years, and 36 different wardens overseeing the facility along the way, the old Idaho Penitentiary managed to compress an entire century of frontier justice into one increasingly unstable stone compound. Number 11. Wyoming Frontier Prison, Rawlins, Wyoming. Construction on the Wyoming Frontier Prison began in 1888, though funding problems and brutal weather delayed its opening until 1901. And once it finally started accepting inmates, escape attempts became something of a local tradition. In 1912 alone, 30 prisoners broke out through a flimsy wood and barbed wire fence over the course of just 2 days, a security failure so embarrassing that the state finally poured concrete walls and guard towers in 1915. The prison's execution methods evolved in ways that are genuinely hard to read about. From 1912 to 1933, condemned inmates were hanged using an indoor version of the Julian gallows, a mechanism triggered by running water that dropped a trapdoor slowly rather than instantly, meaning 9 men died by strangulation rather than a quick fall. In 1936, the state replaced hanging with a hydrocyanic acid gas chamber, which it continued using until 1965, bringing the prison's total to 14 executions across its 80-year history. The prison finally closed in 1981 and sat completely empty for 6 years before reopening as a museum. Tour guides today walk visitors past the original gas chamber and both cell blocks, but large sections of the aging sandstone structure remain closed off entirely, considered too structurally compromised for anyone to safely wander through unsupervised. Over its 8 decades of operation, the prison shifted its inmate labor through a string of different industries, running a broom factory until inmates burned it down during a riot, then a shirt factory, then a woolen mill that actually won a wartime quality award for the blankets it produced for the military during World War II. By the time the doors finally closed for good, roughly 13,500 people had passed through the facility, and today, its abandoned cell blocks have occasionally doubled as a film set, most notably for the 1988 movie Prison, which was shot on location not long after the building had already sat empty and deteriorating for years. Number 10. Eastern State Penitentiary, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829 as, at the time, the most expensive and technologically advanced building in the entire country, complete with central heat and indoor plumbing before the White House had either. It pioneered an entirely new philosophy of incarceration called the separate system, built around total solitary confinement, which reformers genuinely believed would inspire criminals to feel real penitence, giving us the word penitentiary in the first place. The system was abandoned by 1913 due to overcrowding, and the prison limped along as a conventional facility until it finally closed in 1971, having housed both bank robber Willie Sutton, who famously explained he robbed banks because that's where the money is, and gangster Al Capone, who served 8 months there in a cell decorated with fine furniture and a radio. Sutton himself dug a 100-foot escape tunnel with 11 other inmates in 1945, discovered only after he'd already made it out. After closing, Eastern State sat completely abandoned for more than 2 decades, crumbling into what preservationists eventually decided to leave as a deliberately stabilized ruin rather than fully restore. Large sections remain unrestored and closed to general visitors to this day, with collapsed ceilings, exposed wiring, and cell blocks. The museum simply doesn't consider safe enough to let the public wander into unaccompanied. The building's hub and spoke design, radiating cell blocks out from a central watchtower, became so influential that an estimated 300 prisons around the world eventually copied the same layout. A small synagogue built inside the prison in the 1920s sat forgotten and collapsing for decades after the closure, its wooden benches buried under fallen ceiling debris, until preservationists finally began restoring it years after the museum reopened. Even now, with more than 190,000 visitors touring the site annually, the nonprofit that runs Eastern State estimates that only a fraction of its original footprint is actually considered safe enough to walk through. Number 9. Old Charleston City Jail, South Carolina. The old city jail in Charleston opened in 1802 on a plot of land that had already been used for over a century as a hospital, workhouse, and burial ground for the city's poor, giving the site a grim reputation before the jail was even built. Over its 137 years in operation, it held pirates, including Stata Bonnet, Civil War prisoners of war on both sides, and Denmark Vesey, the free black man executed in 1822 after organizing one of the largest planned slave rebellions in American history. The building's original design featured two 4-story octagonal towers specifically constructed to block sunlight from ever reaching the faces of prisoners being marched inside, a detail architects apparently considered a feature rather than a bug. An 1886 earthquake destroyed one of those towers entirely, and by the time the jail finally closed in 1939, decades of overcrowding and disease had already made it one of the deadliest correctional facilities in the American South. The building then sat almost completely vacant for the next 61 years, until it was finally purchased for restoration in 2000. That restoration is still very much a work in progress, and most of the upper floors, along with the jail's darker, less structurally sound corners, remain closed off entirely, considered unsafe for anyone besides licensed preservation crews. The site's grim reputation runs deeper than any single inmate, since the 4-acre plot the jail sits on was originally set aside back in 1680 as public land for a hospital, a poorhouse, and burial grounds for indigent residents, meaning the ground beneath the jail's foundation had already absorbed more than a century of death before construction even began. Local legend also credits the jail as the final home of Lavinia Fisher, often described as America's first female serial killer, though historians note the wilder details of her story have grown considerably taller with each retelling over the past 2 centuries. Number 8. Missouri State Penitentiary, Jefferson City, Missouri. Missouri State Penitentiary opened its doors in 1836, making it the oldest continuously operating prison west of the Mississippi River by the time it finally closed 168 years later in 2004. Over that span, it housed genuinely famous inmates, including bank robber Pretty Boy Floyd, boxer Sonny Liston, and James Earl Ray, the man who assassinated Martin Luther King Jr., who briefly escaped the facility years before that assassination took place. The violence inside earned the prison a permanent nickname. Between 1963 and 1964 alone, the number of serious assaults recorded on the grounds was so high that Time magazine famously dubbed it the bloodiest 47 acres in America in 1967, a label the prison never really managed to shake. A major riot in September 1954 left 4 inmates dead, injured dozens more, and caused an estimated $5 million in damage before state police and the National Guard finally regained control. Since closing in 2004, guided tours have opened parts of the sprawling 47-acre complex to visitors, but large portions, including sections of the gas chamber building and several of the oldest cell blocks, remain officially off-limits due to decades of unmaintained decay. It's a site where the history and the structural hazard are, quite literally, built into the same crumbling walls. The prison's gas chamber, built in 1937 using stone quarried directly from the prison grounds, carried out 40 executions before death row was finally eliminated from the facility in 1989, and the underground condemned unit where those inmates once waited still sits largely untouched below ground. One inmate, nicknamed Firebug Johnson after starting a fire that killed 4 fellow prisoners, spent 17 years locked in the dungeon-level solitary confinement cells in Housing Unit 4, a section so consistently associated with reports of strange activity that even the prison's own tour guides tend to describe it in hushed tones. Number 7. Ohio State Reformatory, Mansfield, Ohio. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield was originally designed as a place to reform young first-time offenders, opening in 1886 with a mixture of Victorian Gothic, Romanesque, and Queen Anne architectural styles that made it look far more like a European castle than an American prison. That original mission drifted over the following decades, and by the 1970s the facility was badly overcrowded, eventually forcing inmates as many as 4 to a single cell. Conditions deteriorated enough that the American Civil Liberties Union filed suit on behalf of the inmates, and a judge ordered the prison closed for good in 1990. Demolition was seriously planned soon afterward, and according to those involved, a wrecking ball was literally parked outside the building on the morning film crews arrived in 1993 to begin shooting The Shawshank Redemption, a production that ended up saving the structure from being torn down entirely. Today, the reformatory operates as a museum offering tours through the areas made famous by the film, but the West Cell Block, the largest freestanding steel cell block in the world, remains closed to general visitors due to decades of decay, collapsed ceilings, and lead paint that the Preservation Society still hasn't been able to fully remediate. It's a strange split, half historic tourist attraction, half genuinely condemned ruin. The reformatory's grounds actually predate the building itself, having served as a Union Army training camp during the Civil War before construction of the prison began in the 1880s. Its most infamous corner is a section inmates nicknamed the Hole, a solitary confinement wing with no windows, no light, and virtually no ventilation, conditions grim enough that former inmates and guards alike have described it in oral histories as the worst place in the entire complex. Preservation volunteers have spent decades slowly restoring individual rooms one at a time, but with a building this size and this deteriorated, full restoration remains, by their own estimate, a project that could easily take generations to complete. Number 6. West Virginia Penitentiary, Moundsville, West Virginia. The West Virginia Penitentiary opened its doors in 1876. A Gothic-style fortress with 24-foot stone walls that quickly earned a reputation as one of the most brutal prisons in the country. Over its 119 years of operation, the prison recorded 36 murders and carried out 94 executions, including one in 1931 involving a condemned man who was so overweight the drop from the gallows accidentally decapitated him in front of horrified witnesses, an incident so gruesome that all future executions were closed to public spectators. Conditions inside remained genuinely miserable for decades, with 3-tier cell blocks so poorly ventilated that summer temperatures on the top level reportedly climbed above 115 degrees Fahrenheit. In 1986, the West Virginia Supreme Court finally ruled that the prison's cramped 5-by-7-foot cells constituted cruel and unusual punishment, a decision that, combined with a violent 1986 riot, forced the state to shut the facility down completely by 1995. The old prison now operates as a tourist attraction and law enforcement training facility, but significant portions of the aging Gothic structure remain closed to the public, considered too structurally unstable for general foot traffic after over a century of neglect and West Virginia winters working against the same crumbling stonework. Notable inmates over the prison's long history included several members of Charles Manson's extended family circle and Harry Powers, a serial killer known as the Bluebeard of Quiet Dell, who murdered 2 widows and their children after luring them through Lonely Hearts newspaper advertisements. The prison's population peaked at roughly 2,000 inmates in the early 1960s, more than 4 times what the facility was originally designed to hold, and by the time it finally closed, the state had spent decades simply patching an aging Gothic structure that had never been built to handle that kind of sustained overcrowding. Number 5. New Mexico State Penitentiary, Santa Fe, New Mexico. On the night of February 2, 1980, inmates at the Penitentiary of New Mexico overpowered a small group of guards during a routine cell count, and within just 22 minutes had seized full control of the entire facility. What followed over the next 36 hours became, by most historical accounts, the single most violent prison riot in American history, with inmates taking 12 officers hostage while turning their fury on fellow prisoners suspected of acting as informants for the administration. By the time state police finally regained control, 33 inmates were dead, many killed through torture and mutilation carried out by other prisoners, and more than 200 people had been treated for injuries. The scale of destruction was staggering enough that New Mexico's legislature appropriated over $100 million afterward just to rebuild and reform the state's entire prison system, a process that took years to fully implement. The original penitentiary building where the riot took place was eventually closed in 1998, and while tour groups occasionally walk through parts of the site today as a piece of grim state history, entire wings, particularly the areas where the worst violence occurred, remain officially sealed off. Guides reportedly still won't allow photographs in certain spots, including a section of floor where the concrete still bears marks from that single brutal night. A crucifix hanging in the prison's small Catholic chapel survived the fires that swept through the main building during the riot, singed but intact, and inmates who huddled near it later credited it with getting them through the worst of the violence. Archbishop Michael Sheehan eventually had the singed cross moved to a cathedral in Santa Fe in 2011, where a plaque now commemorates the riot for visitors who likely have no idea the object in front of them survived one of the deadliest 36 hours in American prison history. Number 4. Old Joliet Prison, Joliet, Illinois. Built starting in 1857 using limestone quarried on site by convict labor, Old Joliet Prison operated for 144 years, eventually becoming one of the most recognizable prisons in America thanks to its brief but iconic appearance in the 1980 film The Blues Brothers, where John Belushi's character earns the nickname Joliet Jake, walking out its front gate. A congressional subcommittee toured the prison as early as 1972 and urged its closure, with one representative describing conditions bluntly as having a medieval air about it, adding simply, "It is dark and it is damp." Despite that assessment, the prison remained operational for another 3 decades, finally closing in 2002 when Illinois shut it down largely to save money, transferring the remaining inmates to the newer Stateville Correctional Center nearby. What happened next was unusual. The state essentially walked away and left the building exactly as it was, with instruments still sitting in the prison chapel and paperwork left scattered in offices for the next 15 years. Volunteers and a local museum eventually began offering limited tours starting in 2018, but that access covers only a fraction of the 24-building, 15-acre complex. Most of the site remains completely unrestored, structurally unstable, and closed off, meaning the prison that Prison Break later used as its fictional Fox River Penitentiary is, in large part, still genuinely too dangerous to actually enter. At its peak, the prison held more than 1,300 inmates in cells as small as 28 square feet, sometimes crammed 3 men to a space designed for 1, with nothing more than a pair of buckets for water and waste. The 1980 Blues Brothers scene lasted barely 5 minutes on screen, but it left such a lasting impression on Route 66 fans that decades later, on the film's 40th anniversary, the museum hosted an outdoor screening inside the actual prison yard, with hundreds of attendees watching Belushi's release scene play out on a 45-foot screen just a few dozen yards from where it was originally filmed. Number 3. Tennessee State Penitentiary, Nashville, Tennessee. The Tennessee State Penitentiary, known locally simply as the Castle, opened its doors in 1898, admitting 1,403 inmates on its very first day, despite being built to hold only 1,000. Over the following century, its imposing stone walls housed a long list of infamous prisoners, including James Earl Ray, the man convicted of assassinating Martin Luther King Jr., who briefly escaped from Tennessee custody years before landing there. A federal class action lawsuit over the facility's inhumane conditions eventually forced its closure in 1992, with the court issuing a permanent injunction banning the state from ever housing inmates there again. Rather than sitting completely empty, the abandoned prison became an unusually popular filming location, appearing in The Green Mile, Walk the Line, and several other productions, largely because its authentic decay was simply impossible for a studio set to replicate. That filming access came to an abrupt end in 2011, when officials declared the entire interior officially off-limits due to widespread asbestos contamination. A tornado then tore through the site in March 2020, causing significant additional structural damage to a building that was already falling apart. Today, the Tennessee State Penitentiary remains completely inaccessible to the public, a genuinely hazardous ruin sitting quietly off Interstate 40, waiting for a restoration plan that has yet to materialize. Number 2. Lorton Reformatory, Lorton, Virginia. Lorton Reformatory opened in 1910 as the District of Columbia's workhouse, a facility built specifically to house Washington's prisoners outside the city limits, and it eventually grew into a sprawling 2,700-acre complex with its own railroad. Its most historically significant chapter came in November 1917, when dozens of suffragists arrested for picketing outside the White House were brought to Lorton and subjected to what later became known as the Night of Terror, during which guards beat and abused the women in an attempt to break their protest. Over the following decades, Lorton earned a reputation as one of the most violent and overcrowded prisons in the country, home to a maximum security lockdown unit, inmates grimly nicknamed the House of Pain. Notable prisoners over the years included musician Chuck Brown and Watergate figure G. Gordon Liddy, while ongoing financial and management problems within the district's prison system eventually led Congress to order the entire facility closed in the late 1990s, with the last inmates finally transferred out in November 2001. Much of the original site has since been redeveloped into apartments, schools, and an arts center, a transformation officials have proudly marketed under the name Liberty. But large sections of the original grounds required extensive environmental cleanup after decades of industrial and prison waste contaminated the soil, and several of the oldest, most deteriorated buildings remain fenced off entirely, still too hazardous to redevelop or safely enter. The redevelopment came with an unmistakable sense of irony baked into the branding, right down to street names like Reformatory Way and Sallyport Street, running through what's now a quiet suburban neighborhood. Cleanup crews working ahead of construction had to excavate contaminated soil, remove buried waste drums, and cap an old landfill under supervision from Virginia's environmental regulators before any of the new housing could safely go in, a process that took years and cost tens of millions of dollars before the first families ever moved into what used to be a maximum security cell block. Number 1. Holmesburg Prison, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. No list like this one ends anywhere else. Holmesburg Prison opened in 1896 to relieve overcrowding at Philadelphia's older county jail, and it quickly earned a reputation brutal enough to be nicknamed the Terror Dome. In the brutal summer of 1938, guards locked hunger-striking inmates into a room and cranked the heat to nearly 200 degrees for close to 60 hours straight, killing several men in what later became known as the Bake Oven Deaths. Holmesburg's darkest chapter, though, ran from 1951 to 1974, when University of Pennsylvania dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman used the prison as a private research laboratory, later remarking that when he first walked in, all he saw was acres of skin. Over more than 2 decades, Kligman and his funders, including Dow Chemical, Johnson & Johnson, and the U.S. Army, exposed an estimated 90% of the prison's population to herpes, radioactive isotopes, psychoactive drugs, and dioxin, all without anything resembling meaningful informed consent, research that quietly helped develop the acne treatment Retin A. Holmesburg finally closed in 1995, and while portions of the campus have occasionally been reopened for prisoner overflow during large events, the majority of the original stone fortress sits abandoned, decaying, and firmly off-limits to the public. Correctional officers still occasionally train inside the administration building, meaning one of the most infamous sites in American medical history remains, quite literally, an active crime scene nobody's allowed to casually walk through. 13 prisons, sealed behind asbestos warnings, collapsed ceilings, and decades of decay, and every single one of them proves that some doors stay locked for a reason. From a bake oven death chamber to a riot scene still marked in the concrete, the line between historic landmark and genuine hazard turns out to be thinner than most tour brochures let on. If you enjoyed this one, hit like, subscribe for more of these, and let me know in the comments which of these you'd be brave enough to walk into. See you in the next video.